Okay, guys, chapter 16. This is going to focus on European colonization, specifically in the Americas. So remember, you should always be able to articulate or explain, the causes of European exploration, right? That was a DBQ. What drove exploration? There were, probably what drove exploration was obviously, to obtain gold and silver, but what allowed exploration to happen as well, right? So remember, the goal was to initially, or not initially, but to find new trade routes to kind of, at least for the Spanish and for the Portuguese, to overcome the Italian monopolies. Remember, the Italians were the middlemen along the Silk Roads. So the Portuguese, and then the Spanish, around Africa through the Indian Ocean. Obviously, new technologies helped. They borrowed the compass from the Chinese, the astrolabe from Arabs. The goal was also to spread religion. I don't think that was the driving force, maybe more used to justify. But I think obtaining gold and silver was at least after Columbus's exploration, or at least probably in and around the time of Cortez's conquest in Mexico, did that become a driving force. Maybe not initially, but as time would go on and Europeans would discover silver in Peru, that's when it's really going to explode. So probably initially it's, to find the trade route, the overcome that monopoly, and then, the gold and silver trade kind of ramped up. Land was important too. Don't forget the primogeniture laws, right? So especially in England, if you were the son of a landowner, you may not get an inheritance of land. It was the oldest son that would receive that inheritance. So if you were the second, third, or fourth son, you were out. You didn't have land. So, a lot of young men saw an opportunity to maybe find land. And just new business methods, or called joint stock companies, right? Kind of like a modern day corporation. Investors would pool their money. The idea would be to reduce risk. And two of the most famous joint stock companies would be the Dutch East India Company. You're going to do a little reading after this about that company, and the British East India Company. So I would definitely remember those joint stock companies. I think that's an important piece to this. That's a change economically, right? And these joint stock companies, the government, or the kings and queens, they would basically issue charters. So, a joint stock company couldn't go explore unless they had a charter to establish, a colony. So there was a connection between government. All right, what is the effect, right? That's a great essay question. The impact of exploration. Well, mostly, negative for Native Americans, right? So there were demographic consequences, especially. So, populations decline, which is, demography is population. So that's what that means. Remember, natives were free from disease because of their isolation, but obviously, European contact changed all of that. So population declines mostly because of disease, but other factors too, like war, definitely. Maybe be able to, explain some of the diseases or identify them, like smallpox or measles. And 90% of tribal populations declined over time. Two conquistadors you want to remember, again, would be Cortez. He wiped out the Aztecs, and Francisco Pizarro, who wiped out the Incas. And again, it's because of their explorations where the idea of obtaining gold and silver will then really ramp up. Okay. All right. The Columbian Exchange. Definitely want to be able to, explain the significance of it. Not necessarily, you want to explain what it was, but how it was important. This will probably be your DBQ for Unit 4. So you definitely want to, be knowledgeable. Disease, major exchange. So obviously it's named after Columbus. It's really explains the exchange of goods, ideas, disease, even labor between not only Europe, but Africa and the Americas, right? So it's not triangular trade, be careful. It's the initial exchange of things, right? Triangular trade is something that really emerges in the 1600s, right? We're talking about the really the 1500s when it comes to the Columbian Exchange. So be careful there. The triangular trade would be an extension of this. Okay, so what's coming from Europe? Livestock, cattle, wheat, grapes from, if you think of wine from Italy, right? Grapes. Horses, very important. Those are going to help nomadic groups like the Plains Indians, like the Sioux. Obviously, cattle will be used for a variety of things, right? And on the downside, you have environmental problems like rats and mosquitoes. And that's going to put some stress on the environment. And obviously, rats do carry disease. All right, from the Americas, what's coming to Europe? If you've not sure, but this is a famous sculpture monument in Dublin, Ireland. Represents the potato famine, right? So, in Ireland in I believe the 1800s, there was, potatoes were diseased, causing famine, which resulted in immigration. Well, those potatoes originated from America, not Europe. So that's kind of maybe how you remember it. Tomatoes, fruits and vegetables, tobacco, right? They get tobacco for cigarettes. And maize, very important, corn. Sexually transmitted diseases did come over. They weren't deadly, but, they did obviously have an impact, maybe negative impact. The effect, mostly positive. So with healthier diets, you're going to see a huge growth in population, and that's what you want to remember. The Columbian Exchange obviously helped Europe more than it helped the Americans. All right, slavery is part of the Columbian Exchange. So, what else was exchanged? Labor, right? So Africans were brought to the Americas, Portugal, the Caribbean. Not only slavery, but, rice. From the Americas, what was brought to Africa? Tobacco, sugar. Sugar will be cultivated in Africa. Tobacco as well. Coffee. Coffee comes from, I believe, was that the Middle East? But I think coffee was coming from Africa too. You could throw that one in there. Their effect was obviously, highly negative because of population loss, right? So again, a demographic impact. So whenever you're writing, an essay on the Columbian Exchange, don't forget the impact it had on Africa. There were environmental problems too. That's a great piece to add into any essay. Deforestation, as you're bringing, people over, they're going to be cutting down, trees and forests to make way for farms. You're going to destroy a habitat, so that's going to have kind of a trickle-down effect or a domino effect. It's going to lead to erosion. Obviously, the soil will be, less protected. Soil depletion, as you can overfarm, and that results in the destruction of basically good soil, which forces people to move to a better location. So you're just, kind of continuing this environmental, destructive behavior, and just an overall strain on natural resources like water, right? As communities develop in the Americas, you're going to have, more pollution, and you're going to have overuse of water, and in some cases, you're probably going to use up water sources. All right, so what were the economic changes during this time? A new system of labor known as the encomienda system emerges, and it's a Spanish labor system. It's not slavery, but it kind of is in a sense. It was actually established by the government of Spain to actually kind of look out for natives, but it didn't really do that. So natives, basically, it justified the use of Native Americans for labor. However, conquistadors had to treat them well, provide food, shelter, and assimilate them. Very important. Introduce them to Catholicism. So it was kind of a contract, but very often the treatment was terrible. You're going to read a short essay about that. Obviously, the system of mercantilism is growing during this time. Definitely be able to explain this system. For an essay on the Columbian Exchange, mercantilism might be context, right? So the government has control of the economy, and the goal is to export more than you bring in, right? So take raw materials from a colony and sell your goods, your finished goods, in that colony. So mercantilism is tied into colonialism. You might place high tariffs on goods from other countries to protect your business, right? Limit imports and promote exports. It's all revolved around silver too. That's the goal. Obtain gold and silver so that you can then, buy things with it. Even though that's importing, it's still important to have that gold and silver, right? That increases the wealth of your country. Silver mining is obviously going to result from the encomienda system, or it's all connected. So, especially in mountainous locations like Peru, you're going to have silver mining. So this is where the Mita system comes in. So the Spanish are going to modify that, actually, especially in the Inca locations. Villagers would have to send the Spanish peninsulares, or the viceroys, or the government, a certain percentage of male population to mine. So instead of the Inca government requiring labor, now it's the local Spanish government. The mercury amalgamation process that was actually in your textbook, there was a more efficient way to mine, but the problem was it was very highly toxic for natives, so there was a consequence there too. Talk about a decline in population. Don't forget the harsh labor conditions. Overall, though, it strengthened the Spanish economy, but very important, it did lead to inflation. When you infuse silver or gold or any kind of money into an economy, prices are going to rise. It's just natural, right? When people have money in their pocket, sellers will charge more, right? If you know someone has some money, you're going to charge more, right? Supply and demand in a sense. So inflation is going to increase in Europe, but overall, the economies of Spain, England, and Portugal are going to really grow quite a bit. In the Pacific Ocean, Spain had trading posts in the Philippines. Manila was today is the capital of the Philippines. So they're obviously that's going to allow them to trade with China. You can sell goods in the Philippines. That's important too, right? Again, silver is important because you can exchange it for porcelain in China, right? For example, the Chinese are going to start to use silver as currency. So they want it. They're going to sell their porcelain for that. So remember, the Europeans aren't making things. It's not like the Chinese. The Europeans are again, they're buying things, and they're going to use silver to obtain those types of things. Europeans were not known for their innovations, that's for sure, compared to, say, the Chinese and other groups like the Arabs. Sugar was very important. That is going to be a cash crop that the Portuguese are going to begin to farm in the Americas. They're going to initiate the slave trade. That's important to remember. The slave labor will be used in Brazil, especially. The Spanish are going to then follow and establish sugar plantations in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, and all over the Caribbean. Not so much, some African slaves in, say, Mexico, but not necessarily, not really, not to the extent that you're going to see slavery in the Caribbean. One reason they turned to Africans, natives were not great as laborers. They were not used to the disease, the hard work, for example. Africans were used to working in harsh conditions, and that's important. So, 5 to 10% of slaves were killed, so it was still dangerous, but I would probably say that number is much higher for natives. All right, what were the political changes? So you're going to see conquest, and that's important. Those American Indian empires are going to fall, and that's it. Around 1519 and 1532, Hernan Cortez defeats Montezuma, and the city of Tenochtitlan is taken by the Spanish. And this is where I think this thirst or lust for gold really increases. 13 years later, we're going to see Francisco Pizarro and his brothers execute Atahualpa. This is Montezuma, by the way. Disease was more of a factor. Actually, Cortez was a great military leader. He was able to kind of, blockade the city and starve them to death. The people of the Aztec people actually had killed Montezuma earlier, but the new leaders finally gave up because of Cortez. Cortez didn't have many men, but he was able to, again, he had enough men and enough firepower to surround the city and prevent food from going in and out. The Treaty of Tordesillas, very important, again, a political event. The Pope in 1484, to avoid conflict between Spain and Portugal, two Catholic countries, divides the region in half. There's the line, if you can see it. On the eastern side of that line, these territories, especially Brazil, off of the coast of Africa, would be Portuguese, and everything to the west would be Spanish. Hence why if you go to Brazil today, they speak Portuguese. Both the Portuguese and the Spanish established kind of a government. Viceroys were representative of both the Spanish and Portuguese crowns. They kind of, governed the colonies and obviously reported back to the kings and queens. And audiencias were royal courts for Spanish settlers. I would probably argue they would favor Spanish settlers over Native Americans. Because of the slowness, it was difficult to govern. Columbus was actually a governor in Cuba. He was brutal. He was so brutal that he was actually arrested and thrown in jail. Columbus died of failure on a lot of levels, but he was able to do what he wanted to do.